Hello, my name is T-Rex, and welcome to my podcast show called Something Positive. Each week, I'm very lucky I get to speak to some amazing people who at times have gone through some very challenging life situations, but not everyone. The one thing in common with everyone I do speak with is they want to be able to share some of the positive angles and silver linings that they've learned throughout life. So tune in and remember, no matter what you're going through, you're not alone. Hello, Kevin. Welcome to my podcast, Something Positive. How are you today, Kevin?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no worries. Whereabouts are you, right the way? Tell the viewers, where are you at the moment?
Yeah, I'm based in Phoenix, Arizona. We've been here for about a year. Yeah, about a year or so.
Is it super hot? What's the weather like at the moment?
Today is actually freezing for us, which is about 52 degrees Fahrenheit. So
Okay, a little bit different from us in London then. It's rain here,
yeah,
really, really cold. But I'm glad that it's not too hot. It should be like kind of subtle in a way. You can still deal with it, right? You can still manage
yeah,
through that
you
kind
can
of
still
weather.
deal with it. Just put on a sweater. I grew
Yeah,
up in cold
exactly.
weather, so it's not too bad for me. But
Perfect. Well, we're not going to talk about cold weather today or anything like that or Arizona, but there is an interesting topic that you and I kind of, been talking about for a while. And I thought, since you brought it up as well, it'd be really cool to talk about it on this podcast because also you have some really good experience around this. I'm not going to mention what the topic is this time. I normally do that. I'm going to get you to just say what the topic is today.
all right. Well, the topic for today is neurodiversity.
Neurodiversity. Okay. And tell us a little bit about yourself before we go into the actual topic, what it means. Tell us a little bit about yourself, like who you are today and what do you do?
Yeah, so I am a coworker of yours. I work with you in sales enablement, and that is something I've been doing for a long time. I got my start in my career in sales and real estate, and I kind of moved my way through different roles and different things and ended up really getting into training. I taught real estate agents, I worked in technology for a little bit, and then made my way to our current company. And so really, I think from a personal perspective, I am someone who really enjoys learning. I really enjoy, being creative. I have always had an interest in a lot of different varying topics like history and art, and to a little bit like travel and that sort of thing. But I been married to my beautiful wife Ashley for about 11 years.
Wow,
We
that's a long
have
time.
a well, yeah, we have a dog Ellie. She
Oh,
is a Cairn Terrier. So if you've ever seen Wizard of Oz, she is a spitting image of Toto.
oh,
So
that's cool.
yeah, and
So,
yeah, I'm just a normal or somewhat normal 30-year-old
mhm.
guy, just making my way through the exciting world of tech sales.
Well, thank you for joining. And as you mentioned, yes, we work together. Besides that point, I know you very well. However, we haven't done a podcast yet together, so I think this is quite
No,
exciting. And talking
yeah.
about this topic. So, neurodiversity is quite of a newer term for myself, at least. I mean, I've heard it a little bit, but I've done a little bit of research. But you are the expert in this a bit more. Can you tell us, the people listening and the viewers, what does neurodiversity actually mean?
Yeah, so neurodiversity is a number of different things that deal with the way that your brain is made up. So there's two different terms. There's neurotypical and neurodiverse, right? Neurotypical is the typical human brain is set up in a way where you can typically do the standard things that a normal human does. You can make conversation very easily. You can, do activities without having to really think about them. Neurodiversity is kind of an umbrella term for a number of different conditions or disorders or things along those lines that change the way that your brain makeup is, so the way that your brain works. And I hesitate saying disability in the sense that it's not necessarily a disability in some cases. It might just be a difference in the way that your brain handles different things. I like neurotype in a better word, but this includes things like autism, ADHD, OCD, things along those lines. There's a whole slew of different things that be considered neurodiversity as well, like dyslexia or dyscalculia. Those are other things that go along with it. But yeah, that's kind of my definition of it. It's probably not the typical scientific
No, but
definitions,
this
but
is good. I think it's, everyone's probably gonna have a different, understanding of it. Like I said, I had my own understanding of it. You can definitely broaden it and much more on this conversation than I ever had. Would you say it's like a common like term? Would people normally understand it if you said like, neurodiversity somewhere in a conversation? Would you feel people would understand that already as itself?
I think now in today's climate, it's more known. I think 10 years ago, it probably wasn't as a common of a term to use, but I think today it's more recognized as something that people would understand.
Makes sense. And I guess my point here I want to ask you is we're having this podcast about this topic. Why did you want to talk about this topic? Why come on this podcast and specifically talk about neurodiversity?
Yeah, it's something that I have gone on a journey with over the past, I'd say like 4 or 5 years, maybe even a little bit longer, because I have family and friends that have it as well. And so it's something that it's interesting to see how it affected me and kind of dissect that with someone in a conversation like this, because I'd like to be able to help others who might be in similar situations. But also, I think there's a lot of education that can come from it. There's a lot of different things that I've learned that broke the, you know, misconceptions that I had in my head about what neurodiversity looks like and how people, you know, interact with one another in that sense.
Why do you think it's an important topic? Like, why is it something that people should be aware of and talk about more?
Yeah, I think there's a couple different reasons. The first is that there are a slew of misconceptions that happen around the topic, right? I know when I first was diagnosed with ADHD, I didn't believe it because I thought that ADHD looked different than what I had experienced or that I experienced myself. Um, I know that also there's a lot of movement in those areas. For example, the rate of children who have been diagnosed with autism has grown exponentially in the past, I'd say 20, 30 years. Um, and so there's a lot more people coming up in this new generation who are more informed about it. They understand it a little bit more. But for those in older generations or people like myself who just didn't have exposure to it as much growing up, I think there's things that people need to understand about how it looks in real life.
And just I think you and I talked about it last time just a little bit, but would you say like I don't mean it in this negative sense, but sometimes I feel like it's quite easy nowadays to kind of whip up a term and then everyone is kind of like, hey, I got this, I got that too. Do you think that is the case? And like I mean, how can you, I guess, how do you test that you are you have neurodiversity, like or you fall into those categories? Like how do you do that?
Yeah, I know we had this conversation the other day about like, you go on TikTok and you see all these people, it becomes like a trend where it's like, if you have this, you may have autism or ADHD or something with cluster B or something along those lines. Um, I'll tell you my story because I think it might kind of fit here. So
Please.
I originally didn't really understand what ADHD was. My first thought was it's a, very hyperactive kid running around on a playground and just, destroying everything and that sort of thing. Um, and as I went through COVID, I think right around like the 6 month mark of the pandemic, I just had kind of like a breakdown. There were a lot of things going on in the world and in my own personal life. We moved across the country because of the pandemic. We had, changes in jobs, changes in, living situations, things like that. And I was just very unable to cope with a lot of different things going on. So I was watching TikTok. I was trying to just like zone out, but I kept getting videos about different things that related to ADHD. And I was I was nervous, I think, when I first started to think about like, do I have this? Because I didn't want to just fall into the trap of someone says you might have it, so therefore you have it. I was, really trying to do my research. So I would kind of highlight some of the things that I found, some of the videos that I found, and check myself and say, okay, well, is this actually me, or does it just sound like something? Is this just a one-time thing where I forget what I was doing middle of doing it, or is it something that's a more common theme? So I think yes, there are points where you can fall into that sort of trap of, it's a trendy thing to do. It's a trendy thing to, say that you have. But I think a lot of those videos are actually beneficial for people like myself who didn't have the exposure beforehand. It becomes an educational piece. There are some people who will abuse it, of course, but for those who really do need to understand that about themselves, they can then use that as a way to self advocate. They can go back to a doctor and get a diagnosis and say, hey, I've experienced this, this, and this. That leads me to believe that I might have this form of neurodiversity. So, what can you help me with there? And that's actually what I did. I took what I was, making notes of and the research that I was doing on myself, and I went to a doctor and basically had that conversation, and we did an assessment, and I got formally diagnosed with it. So that's where I would say I think a lot of that comes into play for me, is how it can be kind of a two-sided sword, or a double-edged sword. It can be something of a trendy thing that can be abused, but it's also really beneficial.
Yeah. And like you said, I mean, in this case, looking at this content or came across on TikTok was very helpful for you. I think sometimes, in this era where, everything is kind of, everyone makes their own videos. Sometimes you don't know if that fact is actually true or not. It can sometimes be helpful. Again, it's good that this kind of content might trigger someone go, hey, I kind of recognize these things within myself. And I think that's important to kind of feel that there is content out there that can help you with something. But I think what you're saying as well is, if I'm correct here, is like, just make sure that, don't just self-diagnose yourself 100%, right? Don't just go, yes, I saw this on TikTok, I think I've got it, yes, and therefore I'm going to just categorize myself as whatever, right? I think it's still important to have a proper assessment done. Do you think that's a fair statement to say?
I think it's close to a fair statement. There's one thing I'd probably add to it, is that for some people, especially those who can't really advocate for themselves because of their disability, it may be harder to get a diagnosis from an official doctor, especially in environments like here in the States, private healthcare. And, some doctors are still very set in their ways of, oh, it's not that, it's something else. I've had that experience myself. I've had that experience with family. So there is a benefit, I think, to self-diagnosing in certain cases. I would say it's helpful in a way of understanding yourself, right? Even if you're not 100% confirmed that you have it, if you know that those behaviors, come together, and you don't have access to something where you can officially get a doctor to look at you, you can still use that to your advantage. If in a perfect world you have access to it, I would recommend getting diagnosed with it, so that way you can, see if there's any form of treatment that's available for you, particularly ADHD. I know others, there's not really many treatment options, like medically, but that's the only caveat that I think I'd add to that.
Mm-hmm. Going back to, so that was really interesting, and I get what you're saying, and I think that is an important thing to keep in mind. Before we kind of continue with the subject in general, I'm curious, and I think the viewers might be curious to understand a little bit more about you. Like, talk to us. Like, where did you grow up?
Yeah. So I was born on Long Island in New York. A lot of my family's from New York, so my grandparents and great grandparents all lived in Brooklyn and kind of migrated throughout the New York City area. So I lived there for a brief time. I think I was like 3 when we finally moved away from New York. Most of my childhood was spent in Northern Virginia, about an hour and a half outside Washington, D.C. It was a bit of a culture shock, because you grow up in the city, or you were born in the city and then grow up in the country. My parents are still very much New Yorkers, so I kind of got both sides of, the country aspect, the Southern aspect, but also my, New York heritage. So
Yeah.
I did a fair amount of things in, middle school and high school. I was a student ambassador. I got to travel to Europe and China when I was in high school as well. And always been interested in like music. I was in band. I was in academic team. So I've always been like very good at trivia and just, knowledge, general trivia knowledge, I guess.
Yeah, no, so I was just chuckling because I know that, sometimes we have these work things where we have a game where we like test like knowledge. You're always the
Oh
one to
yeah.
win. Always. It's so unfair, Kevin. I have to say that right now to everyone listening. It's so unfair playing against Kevin because he knows everything. Like you have a memory like no one else. So I take my hat off to you, but it just made me chuckle.
I appreciate it.
That is so the point. And I just realized actually we have a lot more in common. I think I forgot to say this earlier, but the fact that you grew up in New York like I did as well, and then that you
Mhm.
kind of ended up in Virginia because I've got family in Virginia. So it's kind of like interesting kind
Yeah.
of nuances there as well. Anyway, when you were kind of growing up, was there a kind of a time when you kind of felt, when you think about the topic, where you kind of noticed that you were different from others? And did this kind of topic ever come, I'm not saying because I think back then when we were kids, I don't know how widely these topics and terminologies were there. Were they
Mhm.
there? And did you have a sense that, you kind of fit in somewhere? And where did you feel like you were different, I guess?
Yeah. I think the terms were growing as I was growing up. I know when I was in elementary school, my sister actually worked with a company, or sorry, an organization called Best Buddies, and she started a chapter in the town for her school, her college, and I would help her out with a number of different things. And they work with people that have a lot of developmental disabilities, including autism. So I know one of the main topics that I always used to talk with her about was autism. Um, but it was still very misunderstood at the time, I think. ADHD was kind of coming up a little bit, but not as much. When I was younger, I think looking back, it's very clear. Hindsight's 2020, but I don't think I really realized it when I was a kid. But I was in the gifted talented program from a young age. They put me in, well, I think, in first grade when I got there, and so I always knew that I had intelligence. I hesitate saying like above average intelligence because I don't think I'm that smart. But I think for my grade level, I kind of met the mold a little bit earlier. I also noticed that for me, it was a little bit harder to make friendships, especially as I got older. I think one thing with neurodiverse people is that, particularly with like autism and ADHD, the social aspect is a big thing. And you and I have a really good relationship, so I feel more comfortable talking to you. But let's say this was like a brand new person I've never met before, I'd probably be very, very, very much reserved. Um, and I think the social cues in conversations, like I can think of a couple different examples, but like I did not know how to have a proper conversation a lot of the times. I would kind of, fake my way through it. Um, I think there's other pieces of that, as a term that we use a lot is called masking. And that goes into play with, how you as a neurodiverse person show up in a neurotypical world. So you have to kind of put on the mask of, trying to be like the other people. This could be, kind of mimicking the social cues of others to try and make yourself blend in more. This could be um, changing your appearance or hiding some of your special interests to seem more, normal, quote unquote. I noticed starting to do that in elementary school and middle school, and that kind of carried throughout until I really started like understanding my, what I deal with and how I show up, I guess.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think you and I talked about this as well. Like, when we started talking about this topic, and I kind of got a deeper understanding of how you see it and how you kind of categorize it and all that stuff. And I started thinking for myself. And you and I talked about this. Is like I was starting to think, well, what if I kind of fit in some sort of category here? Like I haven't ever really in depth kind of like thought about it, but when we think about growing up, like I was super introverted. I still am. Like sometimes
Mhm.
people don't believe that I'm really introverted because I take the persona of like being very social, and I have that side. But when I used to like study, I could not have any sound around me. It's so weird. Like even when working, sometimes I have to focus. Like I can't have any music, I can't have anyone talking around. So sometimes working in an office space could be really not harmful, but it wouldn't be as productive for me because of all the
Mhm.
kind of stimulants. So it's kind of just interesting just hearing some of those things. Again, not saying that I have anything, but it sparks the question like, I wonder. So maybe I should kind of look into that. But I just thought I just mentioned because some people might be listening in as well and say, "Oh, well, what you said there, that's kind of how I felt growing up," and would you say those are things to kind of think about, like to kind of see if that kind of relates to this topic and seeing if that kind of helps you, research if you fall in these brackets?
Absolutely. Yeah, sensory is a huge piece of that puzzle. I think you and I are opposites in that sense, where
Hmm.
if you need silence in order to do something, I need sound. I need music particularly.
Yeah. Wow.
If I'm not on a Zoom call or if I'm not like actively, doing something else that's not work, I have to have music on in order to concentrate. So I've got my Apple Music on at all points. I've got different playlists that I'll play for different moods or different things. But
Yeah.
if I don't have that on, I cannot, like, my brain just does not focus on whatever I'm doing. I'll just,
Wow.
sit and dawdle.
That's my nightmare. That's my nightmare.
Really?
Like I love music. I can be around, but when I have to focus,
Yeah,
I just need to have silence.
definitely. But yeah, the sensory aspect of it is really interesting because it's like, I think the one thing to understand too is that it's a spectrum. Everything when it comes to neurodiversity is a spectrum. If you don't have something along those lines, if you're neurotypical or allistic is another term for that, you probably don't have many of those cues. But if you are, then you kind of go into this spectrum of I might deal with sensory a little bit differently than someone else. For example, my wife is also neurodivergent. She can't go into a grocery store. Not necessarily can't, but it's harder for her to go into public places because of all the noise. So, like the people talking, the machinery running, the checkout lines going. And I deal with that myself sometimes, but for her, it's much more of an issue than it is for me. Um, Whereas for me, it's like, temperature differences. Like I always feel like I'm either too hot or too cold, and there's never like a good point. But if I get too hot, it's like I'm dying. And it's not just like oh, it's a little bit hot. It's like I can feel it in my skin. It's like my skin starts crawling, that sort of thing. So everybody has their own way of reacting to it. Everyone has their own way of sensory being a thing. But if you notice those sort of things about yourself, and I never want to be the person to say, yeah, you probably have something like that. It's definitely worth a look to see what that might look like. And there are a lot of resources online that give you examples of what those sensory issues might be, or if it's like issues with focus or things along those lines, or social. And I think the one test that I took for autism that's been recommended, it actually shows you in kind of a circle, and it shows you different categories of pieces. I think it's called the RADS-R test, and it'll show you where your spectrum is. It's almost like a rainbow of different colors. So you may have a lot of sensory sensitivity, but very little social sensitivity, and vice versa.
No, that's interesting. Yeah, because I was thinking like besides, yeah, the sound thing is a big piece, and I also know like my niece, she has a very similar thing, like very high pitched noises and things like that kind of come in. So
Yeah.
thank you for that. I'm going to definitely have a look. I'm curious to understand, like we think about sometimes when we have. Or when we feel different, or when society views us different, or gives us a label, or whatever that might be, like you said, growing up, you had again, some difficulties, like, kind of being social and finding friends. Were you ever bullied for, did people kind of, I guess, did they sense that you were different, and did you kind of get bullied for that? Or talk to me about, like, what did you experience because of this?
Yeah, I did. I think it was a little bit more subtle in certain cases and more, overt in other cases. But I know that being in like the gifted, talented sort of scenario was part of that. It wasn't necessarily bullying, but I was taken advantage of a fair amount. Like everyone would come over to me and ask me to like help them with their homework, or can I copy your paper, copy your notes, things like that. And I was like, no, just because I'm, in a higher class than you doesn't mean I know
Yeah.
everything, and I
Yeah.
still don't want you to like cheat on something. Um, some of the more overt stuff was like I tended to gravitate towards other people with neurodiversity, and I noticed that in hindsight, looking back at my childhood, but also in like my current relationships as well. Like it just seems like I connect with them better. So, a lot of those people were also bullied, so I tended to get bullied along with them, even though at the time I didn't really think anything of it. But um, I think the social cues was another sort of thing. Like there's a lot of faux pas where people were just like, "Why did you say that? Are you stupid?" Um, for example, I remember in art class in sixth grade, one of the kids at another table was talking about music, and he said that he really liked Lil Jon, and I didn't hear him right because one of the things with ADHD sometimes is that noises, it's auditory processing. So you can hear the sound, but sometimes it doesn't make it to your brain right away. So you can hear parts of things. It's almost like selective hearing, but not intentional. So I thought he said Elton John, and
Ah,
I knew a lot about Elton John. My dad, had me growing up with classic rock and
yeah.
stuff from the 70s and 80s. So I popped over and I was really excited because that was like, my interest was music. And I was like, "Oh my god, I love Elton John." And he immediately turned around and was like, "Ew, does it mean you're gay or something?" I was like, "Okay, well, that's the end of that conversation." But it's little things like that, I think, that build up over time where it's not always, you're seen as different as a big whole thing, but it's just like people know subtly and then they'll say little subtle things at the same time.
Yeah, because it's interesting because just tying to kind of like one of the guests I was talking to early in one of my podcasts was talking about disabilities in general, and talking about the very
Mhm.
visible disabilities and then the hidden ones. I think the thing with the hidden ones, like you said, this wouldn't like you said, it's not really a disability, but when you think about it, if you think about like how people react to if you have ADHD or autism or something, like isn't the same sometimes as if it was a visible thing, something you had very visibly on you. And
Mhm.
I don't know if you agree with that statement in terms of it's more acceptable, especially nowadays, like for people to have autism, ADHD, so you don't necessarily feel like people are bullying you or belittling that or anything like that. Do you think that is a fair statement, or do you still feel like it's still seen as something that is too far out and it's something that should, like, people are reacting in a negative way?
I think it is not as big of an issue, I guess, because they are very much invisible disabilities. Like if you were to look at me and where I sit today and what I do and how I kind of operate, you wouldn't see like my disability on the front. It's really in like the nuances of my actions. I use my hands a lot. I play with my fingers, and I can't keep focus on things. That's stuff that you wouldn't necessarily notice, but so I wouldn't say that someone would just come up to you randomly and be like, "Oh, blah blah blah." That's an issue. It's more of like when you're trying to find support or you're trying to tell someone about something where there's issues in understanding that may cause not necessarily bullying, but just like difficulties in that relationship. So I've had, managers that I've had or teachers that I've had that haven't understood the fact that, you know, executive dysfunction is a thing where even though I really want to do my homework, for example, I really want to do this assignment, my brain is not allowing me to do it because I don't have like the dopamine to do the thing, to like physically get up. And that was the thing that I struggled with in school. I actually I I failed an English class once because I didn't do the assignments because I just could not get myself to do it. I think I kind of checked out. But it's not that I didn't know the knowledge. I passed the AP exam with the highest score in the class. So there's that sort of misunderstanding and misconception of how things work from a different person's perspective. I mean, I've had people say like it's almost like depression where you have someone tell you like, "Oh, well go take a walk," or, "Go watch a funny movie or something, you'll feel better." It they don't understand that it's not as easy as that. There's more layers to it. I think it also depends on the level of the disability too, right? I there's a term that I think people have tried to stop using as much as high functioning. Um, so there's some people that can get away with it a little bit more. They can act more normal, seem more normal. Other people are not as high functioning, and those are probably the ones who would deal with the more in your face sort of bullying or taunting in that sense.
Do you feel like because of the kind of neurodivergent aspect, do you feel like you got a lot of rejection? in your life because of that.
Yes. And I think it also made it hard for me to deal with rejection in the day to day life that a normal person deals with. So I'll start with like, do I do with rejection in my own life? Have I gotten more of it? Um, I, I wouldn't say just like rejection overall, like, no, I don't want to be your friend, or no, I don't want to work with you. I think it's a little bit more complex than that. It's, people in my life, like friends that I've had or people that I've, been around, it's, you know, I've been more on the sidelines of the
Mm-hmm.
friendship. And I think it's because
Mm-hmm.
of the way that we see how we interact with friends. I actually watched a TikTok on this the other day. It's like, I'm comfortable in a relationship as a friend or, uh, close person. I can, have a conversation with you once or twice. We can build like, common interests and that sort of thing. And then I could go months without talking to you and still feel like I'm a friend. Or someone who is neurotypical or holistic, that relationship for them requires constant communication, right? That's something that blew my mind when I first heard it because my brain just doesn't think like that. It's like, I know we're friends. I like you. I hope you still like me. Um, and it's more of just that, like catching up. So I've dealt with that in my own life. It's like, I have a lot of acquaintances that I know, but not a lot of very close friends because it's harder for me to keep those relationships going. Because sometimes I just don't have the energy to, have a conversation. And then in like social settings, small talk is always very difficult because, a lot of times it doesn't really have a true purpose to it. Like if we're talking about a topic like this, I can bring facts, we can have arguments or, discussions or things like that. But, if you're just talking about how the weather is and how your kids are doing, it doesn't really lead anywhere. So, our brain doesn't see a reward from that. We get frustrated with it. It's almost just like the sort of social niceties, the, hey, how you doing? Or how are you supposed to respond to this, common sentence. So that I think impacts rejection from like a social standpoint. From a work standpoint, I made the interesting decision to go into sales, right? And so when I first got in, there's a lot of rejection there. Have to get a lot of no's to get a yes. And so I remember the first time I was cold calling, and probably one of the last times that I actually truly cold called. I had a list of people who were looking for houses, or just a list of people in the neighborhood. Um, and I think I got to like the fourth or fifth person, and they just laid into me. They were like, "I'm on the do not call list. Don't call my house again. I'll report you if you have this number. How did you get this number?" I lost it. Literally, my whole body was just like in shock because one of the things that people with autism and ADHD deal with is called rejection sensitivity dysphoria or disorder. So, like, if someone tells you no, for a normal person, that just might be no. But if someone says no to someone with RSD, it it's amplified. Like you feel it like, you know, everything just kind of shuts down and you don't know what to do. I didn't understand that at the time because I was 18. I had just gotten out of high school. I knew nothing about neurodiversity at that point. But looking back at it now, it made so much more sense because it ties in with how my brain operates, right? Um, so rejection is much harder to deal with in that sense because even a small no can feel like a huge no. If someone disagrees with you on something simple, it could feel like they're, you know, saying that you're not worthy of something. You're not worthy of a relationship because you don't like the same ice cream as me. Something really weird, but it is that connection that you think is there, or the way that your brain interprets that. Um, can cause rejection to be a lot more of an issue.
I think this is interesting because if you start thinking about it, like I'm pretty sure anyone who listens can somewhere relate to this one way or another, whether it's within themselves, right? Or thinking about all the friendships or people around them. That in the sense
Mm-hmm.
that we're not saying like, okay, everyone that I'm thinking of, yes, might be falling into this category or in somewhere there. But I think what it does, it maybe creates a little more of a level of empathy towards others to try and understand. What are your thoughts on that though?
Yeah, I think there has to be some sort of mutual understanding with it, right? Because I think if you have two friends who are neurodiverse, I think they understand each other a little bit more and they're okay with that. My wife and I, we can have conversations for hours and not even look at each other. And, it's not the typical sort of relationship. There's a lot of like parallel play. Like we'll both be doing our own things and not really acknowledge each other, but we feel close because we're in the same room and we're doing it together, right? When it comes to those who are, neurotypical, dealing with someone who is neurodivergent, I think that's where kind of the empathy side of things comes into play. It's an understanding of like, hey, your brain works differently than mine. So I might do things differently than like the way that you do. Um, and I might not be able to, you know, talk with you as much, but I'm still here. Um, I think it's reasonable to understand that sort of thing from like a neurotypical side of things. Like, I think everyone should, try and learn as much as they can about these things because, there are a fair amount of people in the population that deal with it. At the same time, it's hard to make the expectation that neurodivergent people should be the ones to always be disclosing that and setting those expectations because for some of them it's really hard to even get to that point of feeling comfortable to disclose that. So it's like if you see someone you notice they're a little bit different, they could have autism or ADHD or something along those lines, like treat them with some more respect or empathy, or try and meet them halfway in some of those things. Um, it's not always going to work. It's not always going to be perfect, but I think if it were me, I would respect someone that is at least trying to get to know
Exactly, and
me,
that's my topic,
understand.
right? That's the point. Exactly, that's the point
Yeah.
here. It's like I think it'll by talking about this right now, maybe someone will go, you know what, light bulb moment. Like I want to change my behavior. Like I haven't always thought about this in level. I want to create that empathy towards others, like you said, create that respect, and that's what any common like everyone wants that respect, right? Whether it
Mhm.
doesn't matter who you are, what you do. So I think it's just another. It's a little nuance to just think about it from a little bit more from a different perspective. If you see something or that someone is, just think about it a little bit differently. I guess is what we're
Yeah.
talking about here as well. I think this is a very um, important kind of topic in this discussion. Um, are there any sort of like common misconceptions, do you think, that come with the topic that we're talking about today? And if they are, like, what are they, and what should be done about them?
Yeah. I would go back to some of the things that I've said before. I think the first is that it everyone with those particular disabilities looks the same, right? Um, Autism always looks like a particular, version of autism. ADHD always looks like a particular version of ADHD. For example, I've been learning about OCD, right? Um, I didn't realize that OCD was more than just like, I have to do, three spins around before I can walk out the door, or, I have to have certain things in a certain way. There are a lot more layers to it than the way that I was taught about it. I remember the TV show Monk, if you've ever seen that.
Yes, I remember that one.
You know,
Yeah.
his version of OCD is not the way that other people deal with it. And it doesn't show up in that way for them. So, if you come into that understanding that everything is a spectrum and that people will, show up different ways with different disabilities, I think it'll make more sense to you from that perspective because, you can meet 10 different people with the same disability on paper, but they're going to act completely differently. Um, I think the second thing would be we show up in, you know, relationships. I bring back masking, right? Um, it Masking is something that is really common, especially for people who are, more high functioning. I still don't really like using that term, but they can get away with it a little bit more because I think the expectation for a lot of neurodiverse people is that you have to conform to society, right? You have to look and say and do the things to make you kind of fit in to the box of whatever, is your culture or your area. Um, and so a lot of people will mask. I think the misconception there is like, don't always take a book by their cover because I know with my mask on, quote unquote, and I think everyone still always has a mask in that sense, right? Um, I can come across as one sort of person, like um, I think you mentioned being like introverted, right? I'm
Yeah.
pretty introverted myself, but I can come across as a very bubbly person, and have, things. I can talk in front of crowds. I've done, large trainings to hundreds of people before without breaking a sweat. But, having a simple interaction with someone at a grocery store makes me like cringe, right? So there's different levels to how different people mask. So it's like if you don't see a particular thing with a person that might, raise a red flag and say, hey, they might have something or be dealing with a disability, don't count it out.
If you think about, I guess in psychology, I guess they kind of refer to this as always thinking about, I guess, the inner child kind of way of thinking about it. Like, if you think about,
Mhm.
who you were then to versus who you are now, what would you say to that little child or something like that? And by the way, I'm not sure if it's a proper terminology. It's just something I remember I learned about or heard about many, many years ago. So completely not out there by anyone who's listening who is a psychologist. Please don't sue me for that. But my point here is that what would you say is like if you look at yourself and your growth, like what is the biggest moment or the moment that has most impact for you during this whole experience in your life, being neurodivergent? Um, what is that personal growth? What does it look like to you? What have you learned so far?
I think for me, I'm first off proud of myself for getting where I am today, having the disabilities that it's something that I feel it may not have been the case. And there have been points where I've been just like, I'm giving up, I'm done. I've had cases of burnout related to, autism and ADHD. Like, a little bit earlier this year, there was a point because I wasn't medicated for my ADHD before that. And I finally was just like, I can't focus. I can't do anything. There was a lot of other stuff going on in my personal life at the time. And I sat down and it was just like in bed for 3 weeks. And I finally went to the doctor and I was like, okay, I need assistance in being able to do that. And for me, originally, there was such a stigma in that because it was like, am I really, how is this going to affect me? Is it going to change my personality? Is it going to change how I operate? Um, it it didn't. It was actually very helpful the past few months since I've started on, the medication that I'm on to treat my ADHD. It doesn't really change my personality or who I am. It just helps me be more present,
Yeah.
right? I
Yeah.
can be myself better in a way. So um, I think I'm proud of myself for getting where I've gotten, you know, with doing all of those things, just kind of blindly, I think at the same time, it's like if I were to go back and talk to my younger self and, you know, look at that, I think it would probably be around like, don't be as, um, don't be as upset with people who don't understand it. Because at the time, like, there were a lot of people that didn't understand it in the 90s and early 2000s, right? So you can't necessarily blame them for what they didn't know. Um, and I think, I would also try and tell them to be more proud of who they are, because I think a lot of it was, you know, what I found interesting and what I, had special interests in different things, I felt were embarrassing and I hid them for a long time. I felt like I kind of hid myself for a while. Um, and now I'm able to be more authentic. And that's actually my word for 2024 is authenticity. So like, if I could go back, I'd try and, get my younger self to be themselves, right? Don't be ashamed of who you are and you know, the way that you like to do things and what you like to do and, what interests you, because that's what really sets you apart and makes you unique. And you can find a lot of people and a lot of opportunity through that.
And that's kind of really why I wanted to do this podcast as well. Sorry, self promotion here, but I think this is like the big piece where this is where I'm coming from. Like doing this podcast, I want to speak to people who can help others feel like, you know what, that you might be going through something difficult, or people are treating you a certain way, but the lesson is that you're not alone. There are other people who've gone through it. The other people have also kind of seen the like there are positives in this. And the fact that I think the lesson is like teaching not just people going through something, but other people as well, where everyone's just a human being in the end, no matter what.
Hmm.
I've already been very lucky to speak to some lovely individuals already. And that's what they're bringing forth as well. It's just like you said, just, be you. Right. And that's, of course, that's growing up. Everyone is going to grow up. You have a teenage phase, and that's probably like I don't know about, about you, but, that's when you kind of like figure out like, who the heck am I? And I think that's a
Right.
tough one. But when you get a little bit older, it's like if you start thinking about conversation like we're having today, maybe something like this can help people. Just to realize that I'm not that different. I'm just like everyone else, and I'm my own personality. I'm going to embrace it, like you said, be authentically me, be genuinely me, and hopefully people listening in who might not understand these things will hopefully just treat others genuinely and authentically and as they are. So that's just like, again, my self promotion there. But no, that's just really kind of why I wanted to put this piece together. So I think that was an important thing that you mentioned there. Is there any sort of like projects or anything like that, like in terms of your aspirations, like what do you want to do? Is there something you want to do with what you've learned in life so far, especially around this topic around being neurodivergent? Is there any projects or something that you want to focus on?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always an important conversation to have, and I think being where I am in the workplace, especially in like tech startups and corporate America, corporate environment, I think it would be really beneficial for me to do something. And I think something I find interesting is to teach people about it from that perspective, because as someone who benefits from the managers that I've had who've understood it, and the accommodations that I've gotten directly or indirectly from the companies that I've worked at, that is make or break for a lot of people. And I think the more that people understand it, the more they understand where it shows up in their lives and in their work, particularly, it can make for a better experience for the people who are already there, but also open the doors for other people who aren't in a role that they want to be in.
Very true. Very true. And last two questions is: Are there any other silver linings or positives that you found that you would say, like, I'm going to pass the torch. I'm going to pass my knowledge and what I've learned so far in my life with this, living with being neurodivergent. What would you like to share with the audience? What are the positive angles that you still might think about, or silver linings?
I think the biggest thing that I have, there's this, I don't know if it's a book or a topic that I've heard, is like ADHD or autism is a superpower. Um, I try not to say that particularly, because that, it's a little bit of toxic positivity. There are a lot of difficult things that come along with it. But I would say the thing that I've taken most from it is that I'm really excited about the way that my brain works, right? Like it makes things, I look at things from a different perspective. I see this in work all the time, where it's like we have a problem, and that problem, I think people just tend to throw solutions at, okay, let's do this, let's do that. My brain will kind of take it and look at it from a bigger picture, like, how do things interconnect? I've always been that kid that would, like, take apart something to put it back together and understand how it works. And I love that about myself. I think that's something that I really enjoy. And I think the ability for me to, utilize things that might be, part of my ADHD or autism as well, is hyperfocus, right? I have learned so much in the roles that I've been in, but also about, different topics that I've been interested in. And it makes me, to me, like an interesting person in general. Like, I know all of these random things about global employment and real estate law in different countries, different states and different countries, and things that I was interested in when I was a kid. Like, I would watch the Weather Channel for fun. I was that kid. So it makes me a little bit more, I think, knowledgeable, but it also allows me to have more empathy, I think, for other people, because by learning and putting myself in their shoes, I can, relate to them more and kind of see their perspective and gain a bigger piece of the world. So I would say, don't be ashamed of the disability that you have. if you can find the positive things in it, yes, there are difficult pieces that come with it, and there are ways that a doctor, a therapist, or a friend or family member can assist with those and accommodate and look for those accommodations. But also highlight the good parts as well. Like what can you do with those things that other people might value and that you might value as well. Yeah.
Exactly. That's super powerful, Kevin. That is absolutely beautiful what you just mentioned there. And my last question to you is, what makes you laugh, Kevin?
Oh, I'm going to mention my favorite comedy movie, My Cousin Vinny. If you've ever seen it,
That's a good one.
um, the scene in My Cousin Vinny where Marissa Tomei is sitting on the porch and she's talking about not the porch. It's she's talking about the deer. Imagine you're a deer. That scene gets me every single time. If you haven't seen that movie, I highly recommend.
Yeah, same. So yeah, you heard that. So guys, listen, have a watch and see what Kevin's talking about. Thank you so much, Kevin. It's been a real pleasure talking to you today. Again, you're an awesome colleague, you're an awesome person, and so thankful for you sharing your positive views on, this topic and your life experiences. Are there any final words that you want to mention here? You still have the few seconds left to mention anything that you want to anyone who's listening in.
First of all, thank you for having me. I really appreciate, having the opportunity to talk about this. I would say, lean into yourself, be authentic, reach out for the community of people that are there for you, and, we will support you through whatever we can.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Kevin. Have a great day.
Thanks, T. You too.